This is You Radio. Let your voice be heard. My name is Ryan Funk, and you're listening to You Talk, a program dedicated to diversity, highlighting native-born and new Canadians' cultures and experiences. Representation in media is important. However, many people never get to see someone like themselves in movies, magazines, or on the internet. And when people of color or other minority groups are showcased in media, it's often in the form of tokenism. Nazarie Gonzalo, an immigrant from the Philippines and a member of the FillipnX community, wanted to change that through his photography.
So when I was in school, we had a field trip to a historical city back home. A couple of my friends had a DSLR already at that point, and they lent me their cameras, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna be trigger happy and take as many photos as I can, you know. When we got back from the field trip, my friends basically had a look at the photographs, and they were like, hey, you should be a part of our, because at that point we didn't have a photography organization back home. They were a couple of my friends now, prior to that I didn't know them, but a couple of them were putting that together. They saw my work and was like, hey, we think you can do this. Why don't you join us? And I was like, oh, okay, sure, whatever. You know when like somebody says something and you're like, yeah, sure, I'll get into it. But at the same time, you're like a little bit skeptical, right? So
yeah, no, I understand.
Yes, for sure, right? So, but then I did it, and I was like, oh my god, this is very fun. So I graduated from photography school. I graduated from university, and then I asked to have a camera. And the rest is like basically snowballed.
So what made you want to come to Canada?
So we've had family here for decades now. And the typical story with immigrant families, particularly for Filipinos, is when somebody comes here first, you sponsor the next family to come over and so on. So back in 2016, we just happened to be the next family in our big group of family. So yeah, that's the reason why we came to Canada. And actually, that's also the reason why I wanted to pursue photography in a way, because it's kind of like a hard reset. Like you start from scratch, and I could have either chosen to like work in social media, which I do now, which I still do, or do radio work, which I've done already, or do some teaching for history and political science. But like the biggest question was like, well, which of these makes me happiest? You know, which among these are like the avenues that I would like to take that would make me happier, that would fulfill me. And photography is that for me.
Yeah, you need to find something that you're passionate about. Otherwise, it's just like drudging through each day.
I completely agree. I have had my fair share of working in offices. And I'm just the kind of person where a 9 to 5 just won't cut it for me. I like variety in things that I do. And with photography, I'm allowed to have that variety. If anything, you're encouraged to have different kinds of work so that you have a variety of things to look at when, say, for example, potential clients would like to hire, right? So like, as much as photography has its own repetitive patterns and so on, I'd rather do that than sit in front of a desk for a 9 to 5 and just like work on someone else's work, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, that makes complete sense. You want to be the captain of your own ship. So what inspires your art?
I would say that the biggest inspiration for my art has to be like the idea of representation. It started with initially like, oh, I wish someone would take photos of queer immigrant people of color and showcase them in their best, you know. And as someone who's also queer, I wanted to see people who looked like me and are like me in the media that I consume, specifically Instagram, right? But eventually I grew tired of waiting, you know, so I'm just like, you know what? I'll do it myself. You know, no one's doing, like, at least for within the bubble that I'm in, I'm not seeing people doing what I'm doing. And it kind of bummed me out in a way because like, hey, I'm not represented. Do I wait to be represented, or do I just do it my own? You know, like I'll be the one going out and looking for people who are like me, share the same principles as I do, and then photograph them. So yeah, it's the idea of like representation, not being represented before, not being able to wait to be represented. Like I'll just do it myself.
kind of continuing on that, you know, as an individual who's both a visible minority and someone of the LGBTQ plus community, you know, have you found people to be accepting, or have there been adversities that you've had to overcome?
I mean, in terms of acceptance, like, it's very different from back home, which is a very conservative country in comparison to Canada. But having been here for over 4 years now, you know, and starting from scratch, not knowing anyone, what I really wanted to do is to make sure that I network myself in terms of like the whole artist community. But at the same time, the artist communities here too tend to be like, you know, they also lack representation and all that stuff. The acceptance part is, I would say, relatively better here, for sure. A lot relatively better here than from back home. But there's also always some challenges. I don't want to be tokenized as a visible minority. I don't want to be like a part of something just because I'm Filipino or because I'm brown or because I'm queer. It's a matter of picking and choosing your battles when it comes to who you think will accept you and which ones are just like dead set on like, well, this is what I believe in. I'm not going to be that anymore, or I'm not going to like pay attention to that anymore. It's a mixed bag for sure. But I can get for sure say also that if I was back home, I would not be able to do the projects that I'm doing right here, because the projects that I do here are very focused on the queer communities as well and creating representation for them. But at the same time, I would like to think that the photos that I do, the art that I do, is a way to start conversations within the FillipnX community, because despite having a large number of Filipinos here in Canada, so in Winnipeg specifically per capita, you'd think that like they'd be more liberal with their perspectives. However, the conservative views gets carried over there as well. So it depends on the kinds of groups that I interact with, but it's never absolute, but I would say I have more acceptance here than back home.
Okay. Well, it's a positive first step. It's
a step in the right direction, yeah.
Keep building representation and, you know, acceptance within all communities.
I agree.
So you mentioned FillipnX. What exactly is that?
For sure. So FillipnX is a relatively new term. The first, if you trace its origins, it actually comes from the Latinx movement. And it's a way to create, what do you call this? Claim your identity without specifically assigning yourself a gender, whether like a female, like Latina, Latino for male, and all that stuff. Since the history of the Philippines and the rest of Latin America is the common thread is Spanish colonization, it kind of just like, it makes sense. Filipino as a word is not a word that came from the Philippines. Actually, it's like the Philippines is named after King Philip of Spain, right? So like, well, it carries over Filipino, Filipina, the same gendering of words. Let's borrow this as well. Like not necessarily borrow, but like let's get inspiration from those words and try to create an identity that represents being from the Philippines without necessarily claiming that you're Filipino or Filipina. It usually is like an umbrella term for the queer, non-binary LGBTQ community.
So just creating that avenue and that space and that representation.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and it's also like a more common word used within the diaspora. So those in the motherland do not use that word. At least based on experience, based on like the people that I still interact with back home. It's a more common thing for immigrants to be using that term, at least in the FillipnX perspective.
Okay, very interesting.
Yes.
So how about we talk a little bit about the Philippines, culture there, life there. Before, you mentioned that it was rather conservative.
Yes, absolutely. Growing up, I was in the closet for 22 years. I am only 26, so I've only been out for 4 years, technically, at least to my family. So that in and of itself is kind of like paints a picture of like what it is to live as a queer person, right? In terms of acceptance, the kind of acceptance that you see in media back home is almost just like lip service. Like, oh, you look, a queer person. Oh, another queer person, the gay best friend, the person who will help you do your fashion and whatever. It's always not always, but
the tokenism that you mentioned before.
Exactly. It's very superficial, right? And honestly, this conservative perspective that people have that the gays or the people from the LGBTQ community look a certain thing, kind of like is one of the starting points for me to have that internal conversation of like, okay, am I this? Am I that? Finding where I belong. Um, the only time that I started to feel more accepted back home is when I went to university. People tend to be more open-minded there. Your parents are not there to like police every single thing you do, right? The acceptance there is, it's not, it's, you know what, it's, I don't even want to call it acceptance. If anything, it's just tolerance. You know, people tolerate our existence there instead of embracing it and taking it in as part of our culture. Because in truth, historically speaking, the word bakla, B-A-K-L-A, it's a Tagalog word. It's the closest parallel I could draw is being two-spirited in Indigenous Canadian situations. Now, before the Spanish came, being queer in the Philippines is actually held in high regard. You know, they are regarded as people who can see perspectives of male and female. They're seen as people who are shamanistic and have a connection to the spiritual world. So prior to colonization, we were actually pretty much well accepted and respected. And now the problem is because of conquest of colonization by Spain, America, and Japan, the idea of queerness, of being gay, because like these conservative countries had that like, no, you're only male or female, nothing else, kind of affected that a lot. So basically what I'm trying to do essentially with the work is that like, I'm trying to decolonize the idea that being queer is a bad thing and almost like take like dig deeper in a sense and like understand where history actually comes from. Because the deaths of the queer leaders back home pre-colonially and the community leaders back home pre-colonially are the reason why we are the only reasons why we have Catholicism. Yeah. So, which is like a heavy thing to like tell a conservative Filipino thing. But so I choose to, so the way I try to do it is like almost like a subliminal thing. Look at a piece of work and initiate the conversation within themselves. Like, oh, I didn't know that Catholicism was forced down upon us. I didn't know that queer people were actually accepted before Catholicism, and so on. I went off on a tangent there, but
no, it's very interesting to just listen to, you know, the experiences and what people's histories and culture and what they've learned about it. When it comes to culture in the Philippines, do you feel a connection to it still, even though you're here in Canada?
Oh yes, absolutely. I more often than not, I am homesick. Especially now that I have to live on my own now with a cat and a fish. And sometimes I get homesick most often when it comes to making food. You know, very recently I found myself just growing tired of like the North American palate for food. Because it's just like the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And and like missing, it's like, so me missing that, like missing the food that I can get back home, or having food that I used to have back home or reminds me of the Philippines is like very helpful to me. It was a lot harder when I first moved here to Canada, because the first thing I wanted to do was go back immediately, right? But I am fortunate enough because I moved here with my family, and when we moved here, we already had family here as well. So it's a big extended family already. So that connection is easy to for me to like, what do you call it? Let me rephrase this. Connecting back to my roots. Tends to be easier when I am around people who are from the same place as I am, you know, fellow Filipinos and all that stuff. And I still feel really connected to it. I wish I could go back home, if I'm being honest, you know, but it's not possible right now.
In the current situation.
Nope, not at all. But I think through my art, the way I connect back home is exploring different kinds, like exploring our history. Because I thought at first that once I took on photography, I'd never be able to do my history and political science degree, right? Which was kind of like, oh, I don't want to waste this. But with my latest projects, I found a way to merge them together. And the best thing, honestly, is not only do I get to reconnect with my identity, but also having other Filipino people, FillipnX folks, see my work and participate in my work, and having them tell me and say that like, oh, this really made me feel this, really made me feel that, is like a really, it's like it kind of pushes me forward in a way, because like, well, if I'm reconnecting with my roots, and the people in my community are responding to that, and makes them feel that they're also allowed to reconnect with their roots, then that's it, honestly. Yeah. It's a great motivator.
Future projects in Ali's future is potentially self-portraiture work, as during the pandemic, he had plenty of time of introreflection and looking within himself. In the long run, he hopes to continue to focus more on freelance work, continuing to photograph queer Filipino people within his community. Want to check out Ali's work? Head to his website at aligonzalo.com or follow him on social media at Japes, Jhapes. If you have any stories you'd like us to share or communities we should highlight, leave a comment on our social media or reach out to us on our website. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.